Factoring is actually a prerequisite for Math 1314. So you are expected to know how to factor or remember how to factor, and you may not remember how to factor, or you may be really rusty with it. So we cover factoring in Math 0314, which is the co-requisite course for Math 1314, or the class that comes before it. So if you want, I'm just going to go through the lesson that I present that class when I teach it to kind of help you remember how to factor. If you do not need a refresher, then you do not need to watch these videos. Okay, but if you want to, you can honestly get away with trial and error as far as factoring is concerned in Math 1314. But if you want a refresher on the techniques you can use to factor a polynomial, then you should watch these videos. Okay, so if you remember, factoring is the process of writing a polynomial as a product. So what that means, if I scroll down to the first example we're going to do, at example 1a, we have the polynomial y squared minus 6y. So when we factor that, we are going to rewrite it as something times something else. That is what factoring means. We are not solving an equation. None of these are going to be equations. There's no equal sign. We are simply rewriting what we've been given as something times something else. All right, so that is what factoring is in a nutshell. Not all polynomials can be factored, but if a polynomial can be factored, it should be factored completely. And that means it needs to be factored until all of its factors can be factored no more. A polynomial that cannot be factored is called prime. Okay, so the good rule of thumb to remember is when you're factoring something, you need to factor until you can factor no part of it anymore. In most cases, it is beneficial to write a polynomial in standard form, meaning written with powers of x going down from left to right before even trying to factor. Okay, so that is really helpful. Okay, when you have a polynomial, you want to make sure it's written so that all the powers of x, or whatever variable you're using, are going down from left to right before you even attempt to factor. All right, like I said, there are several factoring techniques that we're going to cover in these videos. The first thing you should always do when factoring is try to factor out a common factor. So we're going to go over that first. So if a polynomial has a common factor, you always want to factor that out first. So some tips for factoring out a common factor. First, the common factor chosen should be the greatest common factor of the terms. Choose the exponent on each variable to be the smallest exponent on that variable in the polynomial. Another tip, number 2, if the polynomial is written in standard form and the leading coefficient is negative, choose a negative common factor. Okay, so if you're not quite sure what these tips said, hopefully by doing example 1, you'll get the hang of it. All right, so going into example 1, the directions say factor out the common factor. Okay, we just talked about how when you factor a polynomial, you need to factor completely. So you need to factor all parts until nothing can be factored any further. We are just going to stick to factoring out the common factor in example 1. Okay, so the videos will build, and then by the end of the review of this section, you should be able to factor a polynomial completely. Okay. All right. So in example 1a, our polynomial, the variable here is y. We've got y squared minus 6y. Okay. This polynomial is in standard form. There's 2 terms, and you're going to hear me say that word a lot. Terms are the pieces of your polynomial separated by addition and subtraction. So I have one term here, the y squared, and then I have a second term, negative 6y. The terms are written with descending powers of y as you go from left to right. So I've got a y squared right here, and then I've got a y to the first power here. So we are in standard form, so we are ready to factor. Okay, if you really struggle with factoring, okay, you may want to break down your terms even further. So what I mean by that is if you look at y squared, that is the same thing as y times y. Okay, and then if you move over to the other piece, we have a minus sign, and then we've got 6 times y. Okay, I have not factored anything yet. I just broke down each piece. Doing so will help you more clearly see what the common term is, okay, or the common factor. All right, so now we're going to try to take out our common factor. So if I look at the two terms, or if I look on either side of the subtraction sign, I want to see what matches on both sides of the minus sign. I see a y in common. Okay, there's a y on the left and there's a y on the right. Each side of the minus sign has a single y. Okay, now this term has two y's, but there isn't a second y on the right side here to match it. So we can only highlight one. Okay, and then that's all that's in common on both sides of the subtraction sign. So what that tells us is that our common factor here is going to be y. Okay, so I'm going to write down my common factor, and then I'm going to write a set of parentheses. I'm going to open the parentheses. In the parentheses, I'm going to write what's left from each piece. Okay, so on the left side of the subtraction sign, I took out my common factor of y. So that means there's another y left. And then I've got a minus sign. Okay, on the right side of the minus sign, I took out a y, so there is a 6 left. And then I close the parentheses. And I'm actually done. This is the answer. Okay, that's all you have to do. Okay, you identify your common factor, you take it out, okay, and then you open parentheses, and from each piece, you write what's left. Okay, notice we started with y squared minus 6y. We have now factored it, meaning we have written it as something times something else. Okay, that's what it means to factor. The great thing about factoring is you can always check yourself. If you multiply out the factored form, you should get what you started with. So I'm just going to jot down the factored form here, and I'm going to multiply it back out. So I'm going to distribute the y through parentheses. So we're going to get y times y, and then we're going to get positive times negative is negative, and this is going to be y times 6, or 6 times y. And so we get what we started with, which is y squared minus 6y. Okay, so we know we are correct. Okay, one final thing before we move on to the next one. Y squared minus 6y, and then the other format, y times y minus 6, they look different, but they represent the same thing. All right, let's move on to part B here. Okay, again, all we are doing is factoring out the common factor. Okay, so this time the polynomial is negative 4x squared plus 12x minus 16. Our variable is x here. The polynomial is written in standard form because we have x to the second power, x to the first power, and then this last term has no x. So we are good to go. We are ready to factor. If you notice, there are 3 terms here. So I've got this piece, this piece, this piece. The last term is missing an x, so you cannot factor out an x. So we're going to have to concentrate on the numbers here, okay? We're only going to be able to take out a number, not an x. Something to notice, okay? We're in standard form, and the first term is negative. So if you scroll back up here and you look at tip number 2, it says that if the leading coefficient is negative, you need to choose a negative common factor. So what that means is, since we're in standard form and this 4 is negative, we're going to take out a negative number. Okay, so watch how this works. Okay, so I'm going to break this down. Well, actually, let me back up. Okay, we are going to take out a negative we're going to take out a negative number, but I forgot to break it down. So if you look at the numbers, you've got 4, 12, and 16. All of these numbers are divisible by 4, meaning I can do 4 divided by 4, I can do 12 divided by 4, I can do 16 divided by 4. So I'm going to break them down accordingly. Okay, so this is going to be negative 4 times 1, and then times x squared is x times x. And then if I move on to the next term, okay, like I said, all the numbers are divisible by 4. So I'm going to break it down that way to get 12. We're going to keep our plus sign. To get 12, it's 4 times 3. And then we've got to multiply that by x. And then we have our subtraction sign, and 16 can be rewritten as 4 times 4. Okay, so I just broke it down further, and you only need to do that if you really struggle with choosing the common factor. Okay, all right, so now that I've got it broken down, I'm going to look at what's common to all the terms. Your common factor, we have 3 terms now instead of 2. Your common factor has to be part of every term. Okay, so all I see here that's in common is a 4 from each piece, a single 4. Okay, like I said, the x does not belong to the 16 term, so we cannot take out a 16. Okay, all right, so here we go. Let's go ahead. We are going to take out a 4, but like I said, the leading term is negative, so we're going to end up taking a negative 4 out. Okay, that's it. Our common factor is negative 4. So we're going to open our parentheses and we're going to write what's left. So from the first term, we actually took out the negative 4. You can think of it this way. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is positive 1. So that's what's going to be left, times x times x. That's what's left from the first piece because we took out the negative 4. Moving on to the middle, we have positive 4 divided by negative 4. So that's going to be positive divided by, well, you can think of it this way. Positive 4 divided by negative 4 is going to be a negative 1. So that's going to be, well, actually, I'm trying not to make this complicated for you, but maybe I did. This is going to be positive 12 divided by negative 4. So that's going to be negative 3, okay, times x. And then moving on to the last term, okay, you've got a negative 16 here. Negative 16 divided by negative 4 is going to be positive 4. Okay, so I probably didn't need to break down the numbers to the level that I did. Okay, meaning I could have just left it like this. Okay, and then, factored it this way. Okay, so if I clean this up, I'm going to get negative 4 times x times 1 is x squared minus 3x plus 4. Okay, now, like I said, we are supposed to factor completely. So our next step should be looking at this thing in parentheses and seeing if it factors. But like I said, we are starting out slow. Our goal of example 1 is to see if we can just factor out a common factor. So we will investigate in a future video how we would factor something like x squared minus 3x plus 4. But we'll go ahead and stop here for this particular example. So I'm just going to go ahead and box this. This is our answer if we just took out the common factor. And again, it's great because you can go and check yourself. So let's take a look. If we take our factored form, which is negative 4 times x squared minus 3x plus 4, and distribute the negative 4 through, we're going to get negative 4 times x squared, and then negative 4 times negative 3 is positive 12. That's going to be multiplied by x. And then negative 4, or negative times positive will be negative, and then 4 times 4 is 16. This is exactly what we started with. Okay, so we know we are correct. All right, moving on to part C. This one is a little strange. Okay, this particular polynomial has 2 variables. I see an x and I see a y. okay? Don't let that confuse you or frustrate you. We're going to treat them as separate variables, okay? We're going to go ahead and break this down. Again, only do this if you need to. Up here in part B, like I said, I broke down the 4s and I really didn't need to because both 12 and 16 were divisible by 4. But here, 18 does not divide into 24. So I am going to have to break down the numbers here. The biggest number I can think of that goes into both 18 and 24 is 6. Okay, so this first term, there's 2 terms here, 2 pieces separated by subtraction. So the 18, I'm going to write as 6 times 3. Okay, again, the reason I'm doing that is because in my mind, when I go through think of all the numbers or all the ways you can write 18 and 24, the biggest number that divides into both of them is 6. Okay, so 6 times 3 is 18. I'm going to multiply that by x cubed. That means I'm multiplying x by itself 3 times. And then I've got to multiply that by y to the 7th. So I'm multiplying y by itself 7 times. So let me see, I lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and that's the first term. Now I've got my subtraction sign. I've got to break down the 24, okay, using a 6. So that's going to be 6 times 4. And then this term only has a single x. Okay, and then it's got a y to the 4, so we're going to multiply that by y times y times y times y. Okay, that's what you get if you completely break this guy down. Again, only do this if you have trouble figuring out what your common factor is. It makes it much easier to identify your common factor. All right, so now we get to pick the common factor. We're looking on the left side versus the right side of the subtraction sign. Okay, on both sides, I see a 6 in common. Okay, I see a single x in common. Okay, if you look at the right side here, it only has a single x. So that means only a single x is going to be in common. Like if you see where my highlighter is, this x has no one to match up with on the right side. Okay, and then I see a bunch of y's in common. I see 4 y's in common. This y matches up with this y. This y matches up with this y. Okay, this third y matches up with the third y over here. And a fourth y matches with a fourth y. Okay, so what's highlighted in yellow is what's common to both sides of the subtraction sign. Okay, so that means my common factor is going to be 6 times x times y times y times y times y. Okay, we'll clean that up in the next step. So now I'm going to write what's left. So I'm going to open my parentheses. So on the left side of the subtraction sign, I am left with 3 times x times x times y times y times y. Okay, then I've got my subtraction sign. On the right side, okay, what's left? Well, just a 4. Okay, I took out all the letters. Okay, so I'm done. I'm going to close my parentheses. And now I can clean this guy up. Okay, so my common factor is going to be, the only number is 6. I've got a single x. And then y is multiplied by itself 4 times. So that's going to be y to the 4th. Open my parentheses. Okay, we're going to have 3. X times x is x squared. Y times y times y is y cubed. Okay, minus 4. Okay, here is our factorization for this one. Okay, just by taking out the common factor. All right, we've got one more. So if we jump to example 1D on the next page, okay, again, this is another strange looking one. Okay, this is definitely not in standard form. It looks funny to us. And the reason it looks so funny is because it's not multiplied out. Okay, so your first thought may be, okay, I need to distribute. Let me multiply this thing out. Okay, which you can do. Okay, but what you need to notice here is that this is a term. Okay, these guys are like, it's like a unit. And this is a second term. Okay, so you've got this lone plus sign, and it's got these 2 units, one on each side of it. And the reason it's actually more work to multiply this out is if you look at this closely, on either side of the plus sign, I see this x minus 2 in parentheses. So you see how I highlighted this in yellow? This is the same thing that is appearing on both sides of the plus sign. Okay, so this is actually our common factor, and I'm going to take it out. Okay, so my common factor is the quantity x minus 2. It is a package deal. It is inside the parentheses, so you need to keep the parentheses. So that's my common factor. I'm going to factor it out, so I'm going to open my parentheses and write what's left. On the left side of the plus sign, excuse me, if I take out the x minus 2, I'm left with 2x. Okay, and then I'm going to have my plus sign. And then if I take out the x minus 2 quantity on the right side, I'm going to be left with 3. Okay, so this is it. We're done. This is the factorization. It has been rewritten as something times something else. So this is the answer. This is the factorization. Okay, this is actually a nifty little trick. Okay, and you'll see it again when we do factoring by grouping. Okay, which is next. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end this video, and I'll start the next one with factoring by grouping. But what you should take away from this video, when factoring, you need to always take out the common factor first.